Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I suspect no one here disagrees with the proposition that drugs can cause enormous harm, ruin the lives of those who use them, and those whose lives they affect. Undoubtedly, drugs are also implicated in a wide range of crimes and are associated with activities that enrich criminals, endanger innocent citizens, and threaten or seriously undercut the development and practice of democracy. There is, however, considerable disagreement over the nature and extent of that harm, the factors that contribute to its many facets, and the best ways to go about addressing the numerous issues that cluster together under the umbrella of the drug problem. These issues are of concern to several programs at the Baker Institute. On Tuesday evening, under the aegis of our program on Homeland Security and Terrorism, led by Joan Newhouse-Shawn, the noted author Gretchen Peters spoke on Seeds of Terror, how the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are morphing into the world's new narco-mafia. It was a fascinating presentation. Our program tonight, Cannabis, Cartels, and Crime, Would Legalization Help?, is a cooperative effort between our Latin America initiative led by Erica de la Garza and our program on drug policy led by Dr. Bill Martin. So you can see that here at the Baker Institute we are addressing this major issue through different vantage points. I know you are all painfully aware of the devastating carnage that has affected Mexico in recent years. In El Paso's twin sister city, Ciudad Juarez, nearly 4,000 people have been killed in drug-related violence since January 2008. The United States, which is concerned for the well-being of a major trading partner with whom it shares a 2,000-mile border, has increased its anti-drug forces along the border. It has also begun to send hundreds of millions of dollars to Mexico to help bolster the Mexican government's efforts to control and perhaps defeat the increasingly violent drug cartels. In addition, the two countries are working with mutual apprehensions to increase collaboration amongst their several anti-drug agencies. The outcome remains in doubt. On the U.S. side, a key factor is an apparently insatiable demand for these drugs, combined with a long-standing legal policy of prohibiting their use. This combination drives the retail prices of the drugs to levels far beyond the cost of production, generating enormous profits for criminals and those who abet their activities. The great bulk of that money comes from buyers in the United States. This has long been obvious, but only recently have Mexicans and other Latin Americans begun to insist that the United States acknowledge this fact and take sweeping steps to deal with its implications. In the process, they have begun to urge the United States to reconsider its adamant insistence on prohibition of the drugs in question. It's a very sensitive issue. President Calderon, bristling at the suggestion that Mexico is on the verge of becoming a failed state, has challenged the United States to take stock of its own failings, especially with regard to drug consumption and laws that facilitate the trafficking in guns and other weapons that have strengthened the cartels in their struggle with the federal police and the army. Even more significantly, the former presidents of Mexico, Ernesto Zedillo, Colombia, Cesar Gaviria, and Brazil, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, co-chaired a Blue Ribbon Latin American Commission whose 2009 report, Drugs and Democracy, Toward a Paradigm Shift, explicitly called on the United States to acknowledge that its decades-long war on drugs had failed. The Commission urged the U.S. government to give serious consideration to diverse alternatives to the prohibitionist strategy that are being tested in different countries, focusing on the reduction of individual and social harm. This message has been received. In her first visit to Mexico as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton acknowledged that the United States' insatiable demand for illegal drugs fuels the drug trade. Similarly, the newly appointed director of the U.S. Office of National Drug Control Policy, Gil Karolkowski, announced that he no longer wants to be known as the drug czar, and he is abandoning the rhetoric of a war on drugs in favor of great emphasis on prevention and treatment. By the way, I just received word this evening that he has accepted our invitation to speak here at the Baker Institute in March, so we're working out the dates of that. In addition, authorities at the local, state, and national levels, for example, El Paso City Council member Beto O'Rourke, Arizona Attorney General Terry Goddard, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and U.S. Senator Jim Webb, are echoing the recommendation of the Latin American Drugs and Democracy Commission and are calling for a comprehensive and open-minded examination of alternatives to drug policies notable for repeated failure. So our program this evening is part of that critical examination. As you well know, there are very strong views on all sides. I hope that our deliberations will enhance the prospects of public policy formulation by all, and I want to emphasize all parties, to address this issue in a comprehensive and effective manner. So it's now my great pleasure to turn the podium over to Bill Martin, who is a senior Baker Institute fellow, has been at my side since the beginning of this institute in 1994, who will introduce our panel. Bill.
Well, I join Ambassador Djeredjian in welcoming you to what I believe will be a stimulating evening. For far too long, those who disagree over the issues we'll be discussing have talked mainly to themselves or to people who agree with them, which can be comforting, but has not led to much mutual understanding or the sharing of information, ideas, and perspectives that might foster more cooperative and perhaps more effective ways of dealing with these complex issues. The Baker Institute, in keeping with the long-standing ethos of civility at public events at Rice, is pleased to serve as a convener of gatherings in which people who hold different views can express them freely with full expectation of courteous attention and response. There are signs that the climate may be changing, that people who are deeply concerned to reduce the negative effects of both drugs and the efforts to control them are taking a second look at some of the ways we have approached these matters. As an example, is just one aspect of the problem, which we won't be primarily discussing tonight. Numerous significant figures, including former drug czar General Barry McCaffrey, have observed that it may be short-sighted to think that we can imprison our way out of the drug problem. In April of this year, New York Governor David Paterson signed legislation enacting real reform of the draconian Rockefeller drug laws, which mandated extremely harsh mandatory minimum penalties for possession or sale of relatively small amounts of drugs. President Bush, the last one, who, like the presidents immediately before and after him, admitted to having used marijuana, and he has acknowledged, of course, his difficulties with alcohol and has had drug problems in the larger family. He wisely observed that a lot of people are coming to the realization that maybe long-term minimum sentences for first-time users may not be the best way to occupy jail space and or heal people from their disease. Last January, Harris County district judges, 16 of them, led by Judge Michael McSpadden, petitioned Governor Perry and the Texas legislature to reduce the penalties for possession of controlled substances, which they contended would be fair and just and have an immediate positive effect on our overtaxed criminal justice system. Judge McSpadden told me that on average of the 26, I think, district courts in Harris County, 30% of the agenda of the docket every day is taken up with the cases involving the possession of less than 1 gram of controlled substance, what goes in an equal package. And as Ambassador Djeredjian has noted, key political figures, domestic and international, are calling for serious examination of a wide range of issues. As noted in your program, my colleague Erica de la Garza, who heads the Baker Institute Latin American Initiative, and I have been working with our colleagues at the University of Texas at El Paso and a vibrant committee, student group, the Students for Sane Drug Policy, on issues of border security. we cooperated and helped organize a 2-day conference in El Paso in September. And although our UTEP colleagues are not able to be with us this evening, but some of them I hope will be watching on the webcast, and we welcome them, we regard this program this evening as a continuation of that collaborative effort. Now, on the assumption that all of you read at least grade level, I'm not going to take up a great deal of time introducing our speakers. I will assure you that each one of them is a recognized, confirmed expert on the topics under discussion. Gary Hale, Chief of Intelligence in the quite large Houston Field Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, for a number of years, has a distinguished record of service in both the United States and Latin America. He has spoken at the Baker Institute before, and I've been able to have several extended conversations with him, and I like and respect him highly and am delighted at his being with us this evening. Ethan Nadelman, the founding director, you like that term? The founding.
I think he stole it.
The founding director of the Drug Policy Alliance is one of the most widely quoted and cited advocates of drug policy reform in the country. He's also been extensively involved in recent years with policymakers and other analysts in Mexico and Latin America and South America. Mark Kleiman, professor of public policy at UCLA, also widely cited by the major media, is a learned, thoughtful, and tough-minded analyst of issues related to drugs and to a range of other criminal justice issues. He's also the author of several important books, including this new book, When Brute Force Fails, How to Have Less Crime and Less Punishment, which is the proper title, not the title that's in your program, which is my fault for not changing that. You'll be able to purchase that and have him sign it a little later on, and I want to say a little bit more. I should point out to you that the more perceptive among you will sense that Professor Kleiman and Dr. Nadelman do not agree on everything in every precise detail. To give our speakers...
Really, you sure?
It's just a hunch. To give our speakers as much time as is feasible to present and exchange their views this evening, we're going to do it like this. To begin, each one will speak from 10 to 12 minutes. Gary Hale, as a representative, though not the author, of government policy, will speak first. Ethan Nadelman will follow, and then Mark Kleiman will speak third. Then each one of them will have 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes, to comment on what has gone before or to elaborate on their views. And the order for that will be Ethan Nadelman, Mark Kleiman, and Gary Hale. Since I'm asking Mr. Hale to go first, I also think it's fair to give him the last shot. Following that, we'll have some conversation among panelists for a while and then wind up with questions from you. And I'm going to ask that if you have questions, there be, I think you already have question cards. You'll pass those to the people who'll be taking them up so that we can make best use of that time. So, and one other note, although the title of our program is Cannabis, Cartels, and Crime, Would Legalization Help? The program itself notes that we're also interested in other illicit or illegal drugs, and our panelists are free to talk about those as they wish as well. So first of all, Gary Hale. Maybe go over here to be a little better. We'll sit here later for the program, but...
Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Surely.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Ambassador, thank you so much for the invitation. Mr. Martin and Ms. De La Garza, I appreciate your invitation as well. It's quite a pleasure to represent the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, here at this forum today. I'm going to start out with some prepared remarks just to lay the groundwork for our continuing discussions and commentary. DEA is a component of the Department of Justice, along with the FBI, the Marshal Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and various other divisions of the Department of Justice proper. The biggest difference between DEA and any of those other component agencies of the Department of Justice is that we are a single mission agency, and also that we have the largest overseas presence of any federal law enforcement agency in the government. Domestically, the Houston Field Division, which I represent, is among the 4 largest divisions in the United States in terms of personnel and geography. DEA, our organization, gets its authority from Title 21 U.S. Code, and it's also commonly known as the Controlled Substances Act. Our agency is an investigative agency, not an interdiction agency, which means that we investigate people that violate the Controlled Substances Act or violate the drug laws. And we don't run around chasing people that are transporting the drugs. That's the interdiction side. Most commonly, Coast Guard, Border Patrol, Customs Service are the interdiction agencies. In my position as the DEA Chief of Intelligence for the Houston Division, I'm part of a team that is the instrument. The team is the instrument that carries out the policies and or laws dictated by our legislature. We in DEA are in the executive branch, and we are akin to soldiers fighting the war in Afghanistan. We're the soldiers in the drug war. I heard that term mentioned, and I'll mention it again for some context. We are the soldiers in the drug war that are executing the policies established by our leadership in Washington, and those policies change depending on administrations, as you have seen throughout history. So I always make this point, to illustrate, if you do not support the war, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever it may be, but you still honor the soldier, then consider the DEA agents as being the same as those soldiers. Overall, in general terms, with regards to our organization, our primary focus is the targets or the drug traffickers that are either cultivating the drug, transporting the drug, or distributing the drugs in the United States. As the Chief of Intelligence for DEA, my job is to serve as the principal advisor to the Special Agent in Charge and other executives and policymakers in Washington. I also manage an operational intelligence program that is the largest in DEA. I have direct authority over all of the intelligence components in the division. We have 14 offices, about 80 people involved in intelligence activities. Half of those are Texas National Guard military folks that are embedded in DEA. And then I have indirect authority from San Diego to Brownsville and inside Mexico for intelligence collection activities of DEA. So that's just to let you know who I am and what I do and some of that background. But I also want to let everyone know that I'm not here to criticize, condemn, or convince you about any one position with regard to the drug issues. I'm here to partake in an educated discussion that may affect policy and in one way or another. And we mentioned the drug war as a rhetorical statement, and from my point of view, being on the pointy end of the stick as one of the soldiers in the drug war, to me it is a drug war. It's a conflict that is marred by death and certainly threats to our national security. A significant number of terrorist organizations partially fund their activities with drug proceeds. Take the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias Colombianas. In Colombia, for example, they tax marijuana and coca growers to cultivate their drug crops, and they use those monies to further their activities as a counter-revolutionary organization in Colombia. Based on our intelligence, DEA has conservatively linked 19 of 43 officially designated foreign terrorist organizations to drug trafficking activities at various levels. Our latest activity with regards to the nexus between drugs and terrorism is in Afghanistan. We're growing our presence in Afghanistan. We'll soon have 75 people, agents and intelligence analysts permanently assigned to Afghanistan in 5 offices. You may be familiar with the fact that just 2 weeks ago, 3 DEA agents were killed in Afghanistan in a helicopter crash while operating on a drug-related mission. In the 1980s, marijuana was the biggest problem facing our country, and Colombia was the primary source of supply for that drug. Mexico now serves as the most significant source country for a lot of the drugs that are coming into the United States. As a side note, most of the drugs coming into the United States right now are coming in through the United States-Mexico border. And the number is in the high 90s. And that's marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. And those are just the drugs that are cultivated or processed or manufactured in Mexico. There's other drugs like cocaine, primarily coming from South America, that come through Mexico on the way into the United States. Given that they're the most significant source country, the cartels are warring for ownership of the corridors that they use to move the drugs into the United States. The number of people dying for the quote-unquote right to bring drugs into the United States is staggering, as the ambassador mentioned. Give you another quick example. In Laredo, I called our office in Laredo today and our office on McAllen, which are on the border. In Laredo, as of today, we have, in Laredo alone, 75,000 pounds. That's 37.5 tons of marijuana in our warehouses. This is marijuana that's been seized by Border Patrol, primarily at the Border Patrol checkpoints or along the riverbanks. So in Laredo, we have 37.5 tons of marijuana in our warehouses, and that does not include the other drugs. If you picture a Volkswagen car in volume, size, shape, amount of space, weight, that's about a ton. Okay, so you take 37 Volkswagens and stack them up, put them in a warehouse. That's how much marijuana we have in our warehouse in Laredo right now. In McAllen, just this week, we destroyed another 37.5 tons that was in our warehouses in marijuana, and that marijuana had been seized from August to October of this year. When I was when I first started with DEA in 1979, marijuana was the big deal. The Colombians were a big deal. I was stationed in New Orleans for my first office, and I went from being a police officer, I went from the intelligence community to being a police officer to working for DEA, and quickly learned that the problem at the time was marijuana coming from Colombia. We worked marijuana mothership cases that averaged about 40 tons per shipment. It was staggering, amazing. We had a saying in those days that was so many Colombians, so little time. And I think we could say so much marijuana, so little time, actually. And that brings us to the topic of our discussion tonight: should marijuana be legalized? Some of you received a CD that we handed out. It has DEA's policies on there about the legalization question, whether we should, we shouldn't, and so forth and so on. Remember, we are the instruments of the policy. We don't pass. DEA does not pass the laws. We're not in the legislative branch. We're the executive branch. We're the ones that enforce those laws. So in that CD, we have a lot of information as to what's the government and the political and the medical and the health and all of the various issues that the United States government points to as reasons not to legalize marijuana. In law enforcement, we don't only enforce the laws, we're also known as public safety officials. So the question about marijuana, whether it should or should not be legalized, if we're just going to focus on marijuana for the moment, is a public safety issue. There is a medicinal marijuana that can be ingested as a pill that serves the same purpose that folks are saying they need the marijuana to smoke to help their health issues, whatever they may be, whether it's cancer or some other issue. So I'll yield the floor and let my colleagues make their comments, and then I'll be happy to discuss any issue with regard to drugs as we go along. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Bill, for organizing this. I should say, I remember I was here 7 years ago for an event on drug policy that Bill Martin set up, and I remember sitting at lunch with the ambassador. And before I got involved in the issue of drug policy, I was involved in the issue of Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy. I published my first academic articles in that area. I remember sitting with you talking about, and the ambassador was the ambassador to Israel and Syria, and talking about that. And I remember thinking what a joke it was that I went from sort of one hopeless area to another hopeless area. And quite frankly, I actually still think the Middle East looks hopeless. Maybe that'll turn around. But drug reform, actually, there is hope finally at last for real change. So I'll talk about that for a few minutes. But let me start off by saying this, that I personally regard the war on drugs as essentially a fundamental evil in our society and in global society. I think the notion of taking certain psychoactive substances, certain plants and chemicals, and treating those as criminal, and treating anybody who touches them, uses them, consumes them, sells them, buys them, grows them, whatever, as criminal is basically wrong. It's wrong. And especially for people whose only offense is to take those things into their body. I think that policy, which evolved over the last 100 years or so around the world with the U.S. government as the principal proselytizer and enforcer of a global drug prohibition regime, has generated immense harm, immense death and suffering and crime and organized crime and violence all around the world. When I hear Gary laying out the how many terrorist organizations are making their money from drugs and how much has been seized and this and that, I just listen to that and I say that's the evidence what I'm talking about. We're talking about a global black market in drugs worth $200 to $300 billion a year that is the most extraordinary reservoir of revenue for organized and unorganized criminals, for political terrorists and criminal organizations of every political stripe. So this war on drugs, this prohibitionist policy, I believe, has generated enormous harm all around the world. Now, I want to focus first on the United States. Part of what motivates me is my shame as a proud American in living in a country which possesses less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We rank first in the world in the per capita incarceration of our fellow citizens. We lock up people at 2, 5, 8, 10 times the rate of most other countries around the world. The Russians are in second place. Keep huffing and puffing to catch up. They can't do it. We are number one when it comes to locking up our fellow citizens. When it comes to parole and probation, it's not just the 2.25 million people behind bars, for various offenses in federal and state prisons and local jails. It's also another 5 million plus under parole and probation. There too, I believe that we lead the world in this. Now, what's driving this more than anything else, to some very good extent, is the war on drugs. We've increased the number of people locked up for a drug law violation from roughly 50,000 in 1980 to about 500,000 people today. And that doesn't count the unknown hundreds of thousands of others who are locked up for other parole and probation violations involving a dirty urine because they're in some diversion program. It doesn't count the people who commit acts of prostitution or petty theft to support their habits because their habits are more expensive because they're illegal. It doesn't count the people getting involved in violence among drug dealers because when a drug dealer has a fight, you don't have the option of saying, I'm going to take you to court. Right? All of this stems from a failed prohibitionist policy. It's probably safe to say that a third of all the people behind bars tonight are there in one way or another because of a drug prohibition-related violation. Now, in terms of who's locked up, I think most of us know it is overwhelmingly and disproportionately young people, especially young men of color. Right? At extraordinary numbers. The numbers of people being locked up, in America of close to, I think, half or 40% of the population being African American, young African Americans having a better chance of going to jail or prison and getting a higher education. This too is an element that I think is fundamentally immoral. Now, if you ask about the origins of this stuff, and if you ask the question, why is it that we treat alcohol and cigarettes as legal and these other drugs, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, hallucinogens, whatever, as illegal? One might think that someplace in our history, some early version of the National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine, got together and they looked at all the evidence. They concluded that alcohol and cigarettes were somehow less dangerous than marijuana, cocaine, and the opiates, heroin, what have you. I don't know if anybody believes that somehow this is how it happened, that this is how we got the first drug laws. In fact, when you read the transcripts of Congress in 1914 criminalizing the opiates, when you read the transcripts of state legislatures criminalizing marijuana and other drugs, it reads a lot more like a Monty Python routine. than it does like any type of independent scientific analysis. If you ask, why then? Why these drugs and not those drugs? Well, the number one answer, there are many answers, but the number one answer had to do with who used those drugs and who was perceived to use those drugs. So long as the principal consumers of opiate drugs in America in the 1870s and 80s were middle-aged white women dealing with menopause, and when there was no aspirin or Motrin or anything like that around, nobody thought to criminalize those drugs. Nobody wanted to put grandma or their aunt behind bars. But when the Chinese start coming over, working on the railroads, working in the mines, going back at the end of a long, hard day's work, smoking up that opium pipe just like they did in the old country, just like many other people would have a drink at the end of the day, that's when you saw the first drug prohibition laws in Nevada and California directed at Chinese minorities with all the fears about what would the Chinamen do, luring our white women into their opium dens and seducing and addicting them. The first anti-cocaine laws were in the South, in Louisiana, in the first part of the century, directed at black men, at Negroes, who was afraid would take this white powder up their black noses and lose sight of their proper place in society. The first anti-marijuana laws were in the teens and the 20s, in the Midwest and the Southwest, El Paso, Texas, for example, and Utah, right? Directed at Mexican Americans, Mexican migrants, coming up here, taking good jobs from the good white people, going back home, smoking up a little of that funny-smelling reefer cigarette, and who knows what they would do to our children and to our precious white women. It's always been, to some very good extent, about who uses those drugs and who is perceived to do so. And that, I'm not going to say the war on drugs today is racist. I don't think it is racist. But it is racially disproportionate in its impact. Its origins are, in fact, rooted in racism. It is not a legitimate basis for continuing a public policy. Now, there's the other negative consequences. The millions of people who have died of HIV/AIDS or are living with HIV/AIDS related not because drugs causes AIDS, not because needles cause AIDS, but because when you share a dirty syringe, a syringe that's been infected with somebody else, that's how you spread this virus. In other countries, including Margaret Thatcher's England of 1985, right off the bat, they say we need harm reduction policies. We need to make sterile syringes available to people who cannot or will not stop injecting drugs today. And they kept their HIV rates low in the Netherlands, Australia, the UK. But here in the United States, especially in the East Coast, where we failed to do this, sometimes throughout the 80s into the 90s, and quite frankly in the state of Texas right till today. Right till today, you still do not have a legal needle exchange program in this state, essentially consigning hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to be needlessly infected, and not just them, but their children, their babies, and people who come into contact with them. Take a country like Iran. Iran has the highest heroin addiction rate in the world right now. 5 years ago, the Ayatollah, who was the Minister of Justice, issued a fatwa declaring that needle exchange programs and methadone maintenance programs are now okay under Sharia law. Makes you wish that our own mullahs in America, not the Muslim mullahs, but the others, could come to the same level of sanity in dealing with this public health crisis. We have alternatives. When it comes to marijuana, I basically think take it out of the criminal justice system. Just take it out. Of the 1.8 million drug arrests last year, 800,000 alone were for marijuana possession, typically of small amounts. I think the risks of making marijuana legal in terms of increased levels of use and abuse are modest. But the benefits in terms of no longer giving a criminal record to millions and millions of Americans, in terms of no longer locking up people and arresting people for this, the prisons aren't filled with marijuana law violators. But those arrests, those pernicious arrests over and over and over again, people not doing harm to anybody else, right? Ending marijuana prohibition would be a huge step forward in injecting a level of sanity into our drug policy debates. Is marijuana a drug? You're damn right it is. Can you get addicted to marijuana? You're damn right you can get addicted to marijuana. But that said, nobody's ever died of a marijuana overdose. The likelihood of getting addicted to marijuana is less than with most other drugs. The consequences of that addiction are less serious than with other drugs. And the ability to put that addiction behind you is oftentimes easier than with respect to other drugs. It does not have the association with violence and reckless sexual behavior that alcohol or other drugs do. So marijuana now, the latest Gallup poll showing that 44% of Americans are now saying make marijuana legal, that over 50% of Democrats and over 50% of people out west and over 50% of people under the age of 50 all say let's do it. I think it's time. It's time. We may well see a ballot initiative in California next year to make marijuana legal. I don't know if it's yet ripe to win. I should say, however, that the principal proponent of that initiative, Richard Lee, his parents, Richard and Lee, are sitting right here in the front row, and they're from Houston, Texas, which is where the proponent of this initiative grew up before he moved to California. We need, when Senator Webb or when Presidents Cardoso, Gaviria, and Zedillo say, let's open up this debate, it's time to open up this debate. I've simply met too many people at the highest levels of the U.S. government over the years who, when you ask them, why is there any sort of really independent strategic thinking about how to deal with the problems in Mexico or Afghanistan or Colombia, never mind the legalization issue, just thinking strategically with all options on the table, you know what they say? No. We can't have that debate. Why? We're afraid. Because God forbid we write a memo, a creative memo about this stuff, and it gets exposed. Next thing you know, we lose our job. That element of censorship and of self-censorship, of open dialogue about drug policy alternatives, that's what needs to come to an end. My hope is that with the Obama administration, we will begin to see that stuff land up on the table. Things are moving in the right direction. It's not just the growing support for ending marijuana prohibition. It's what's happening in Congress with the support for legalizing needle exchange programs. It's what's happening with rolling back the harsh and racially discriminatory crack powder penalties. There is an opening happening right now. So, Ambassador, I wish you luck with the Middle East. I don't miss it. But I tell you, when it comes to ending the war on drugs, I think the wind at last is at our backs and no longer in our face. Thank you very much.
I want to make sure that your program is on here, Mark. Let me just check that to make absolutely sure. I know it's been mounted.
Here it is. We got it.
We got it.
Bill, we got it.
Mark, hand me a glass of water to your bottom left there.
Thanks. There you go. All right, let me just.
I'm sorry.
Oh, good. All right. A brief note here before Professor Kleiman speaks. The program asks, can legalization help? And legalization, better characterized as taxation and regulation, is clearly on the table for cannabis. Are there other drugs, cannabis, heroin, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines? I believe there are other policies that could work better than what we now have, but clearly those legalization is not feasible to talk about now. Many people who are in prison or jail are there because of these other drugs. Professor Kleiman has written extensively in books and on the blog, The Reality-Based Community, about marijuana. Has a couple of books about that. But his new book, When Brute Force Fails, How to Have Less Crime and Less Punishment, he examines a number of promising ways to reduce crime and punishment and deal with these issues without throwing people in the can and sitting on the lid. And I've asked him to talk about some of those as part of his presentation, which will also give you an idea about what's in his book.
Bill, thank you very much. Ambassador, Mr. Lagarza, and it's always a pleasure to be on a podium with Mr. Hale and Ethan Nadelman. The prospect that we could do something about the crime either here or in Mexico by legalizing cannabis seems to be not very strong, because it's not cannabis that's the big generator of crime among users or among dealers. Nor is it the largest drug market. Total retail value of illicit drugs sold in the U.S. is on the order of $60 or $65 billion. Something like $10 or $12 billion of that is cannabis. The bulk of the money is heroin and cocaine, with cocaine by far the leader. And those are also the drugs that generate user crime to pay for drugs and crime among retail dealers around the illicit markets, partly for the reasons that Ethan laid out, that a business dispute in an illicit market isn't settled in court, but is handled by the law firm of Smith & Wesson. but also for the much more direct reason that somebody in a retail drug market who can't call the cops because he's got an illegal substance on him is a very good target for robbery. He's standing there, after all, with valuable inventories and cash, and therefore needs to be armed to defend himself. And when you have a bunch of young armed men standing around a street corner, and they have a dispute about who looked at whose girlfriend the wrong way, that dispute ends in gunfire rather than fisticuffs. So that's a large source of crime, and again, the crime by users to pay for their habits is a large source of crime. I didn't ask how these controls work. Oh, here's the mouse. Okay, great, excellent.
You've got the right and left there.
Excellent. So, as a policy analyst by trade, my training is to ask the question, what course of action would best serve the public interest under some set of circumstances? And in order to do that, you have to ask what it is you're concerned about, what the outcome measures are you care about. So it seems to me there are at least three sets of problems we care about with respect to drugs, whether illicit or illicit. I've always regarded carving off alcohol as if it were a different topic from drugs to be a little bit weird. Since if you look at drug abuse in the U.S., overwhelmingly the drug people abuse is alcohol. If you look at drug-related crime in the United States, overwhelmingly the drug involved is alcohol. To discuss drug policy without discussing alcohol and tobacco is like discussing naval policy without discussing the Atlantic or the Pacific. So what problems can we have? I'll leave tobacco out for the moment because that's mostly a health problem. If we're thinking about intoxicants, particularly addictive intoxicants, we can have three different sets of problems. We can have drug abuse or drug dependency, right? People damaging themselves and other people as a result of either their intoxication or their chronic use of a drug. And for anybody who's had that problem personally or in his family, we know how horrible that can be. We've got drug-related crime by users, either because they're intoxicated and irresponsible. That's the main pattern with alcohol. Right? Not many people steal to support their alcohol habit. It's not that expensive. But lots of people beat somebody up under the influence of alcohol. Something like 1/3 of the homicides committed in the United States are committed drunk. Another third are committed against somebody who's drunk. So the homicide problem is very heavily an alcohol problem. We have crime by and among and against dealers. And we have the crime around flagrant open drug markets. Retail drug markets are crime magnets. So that's the second problem. We have drug-related crime. And the third problem, as Ethan mentioned, is we have incarceration. 2.4 million people behind bars. Yes, Russia is second to us right now in incarceration rate. But, again, as Ethan mentioned, I don't want you to get the misimpression that he and I agree on anything, but as long as that extraordinary event occurs, I might as well call it out. Very concentrated by race and by class within race. Right? It's not the case that the African American community has a large incarceration problem. It's the case that the African American high school dropout community has a large incarceration problem. And that incarceration problem is quite astounding. Black man who drops out of high school has a better than even chance of serving prison time before the age of 30. If we look at the African American community as a whole, so a calculation was done by Bill Stuntz at Harvard Law School. We look at the incarceration rate in that community, which is now, I think, about 4,500 per 100,000, compared to about 700 per 100,000 for the U.S. population generally. Right, that's 1% of adults behind bars at any one time. But if we look at the African American community and take its incarceration rate, it turns out to be higher than the incarceration rate of the Soviet Union the day Stalin died. Can you say land of the free? I thought you could. So, I want to suggest that we have an intolerable crime problem and an intolerable incarceration problem. We don't actually have, compared to the rest of the world, a very big drug problem. We use more illicit drugs than most other countries, but less alcohol and somewhat less prescription drugs. But we have a terrible crime problem, right? We have half as much crime as we had 15 years ago, but we have 2.5 as much times as much crime as we had during the 1950s. So, I want to ask not whose fault this is or what racist ideology led to it, but what we can do about it. And not going to particularly talk about legalization. We could, of course, legalize any of the currently illicit drugs and accept more drug abuse in return for less incarceration, right? Unless, possibly with methamphetamine and cocaine, we could run into a lot of incarceration due to irresponsible behavior under the influence. But if the drugs were legal and cheap, people wouldn't steal to buy them any more than they steal to buy alcohol. And for heroin and the other opiates, and for cannabis, users mostly either listen to music, giggle, or go to sleep. So I wouldn't expect to get too much user-related crime. But on the other hand, we have a lot more drug abuse. What could we do about alcohol? Right? The number one crime drug. Well, I'd like to reduce or abolish the minimum legal drinking age, which makes untold tens of millions of young Americans lawbreakers who don't break the laws in any other way. Combine that with zero blood alcohol content for the first 5 years of driving, and higher alcohol taxes, and we could have less lawbreaking and less alcohol abuse, and less drunk driving. We could also ban the sales of alcohol to people who, when they drink, misbehave. Think about it, it's sort of odd that if somebody drinks and drives, we take away his driving license and leave his drinking license. But that's particularly true of people who get drunk and beat other people up. Why shouldn't they be forbidden to buy alcohol, just the way kids are forbidden to buy alcohol, and ask the sellers to enforce that? I mentioned the flagrant street markets. It's been demonstrated that we can break up those markets, but it's extraordinarily expensive. In New York City, it was 1,000 cops for 6 months and 17,000 felony arrests to break up the Lower East Side Alphabet City market. But David Kennedy has demonstrated that by operating strategically, by identifying all the drug dealers in a market and making cases against them, and then telling them that they have all of them at once, that they have a choice of either quitting right now or going to prison right now, you can put an end to the market right now. And when there are no sellers, the buyers stop coming. And when the buyers stop coming, there's nobody to sell to. In High Point, North Carolina, they made 5 arrests 5 years ago, broke up a market that they'd been fighting without success for 20 years. There's a large population of people who commit property crimes to buy drugs and occasionally violent crimes under the influence of drugs. And as Ethan pointed out, people do cycle in and out of prison because they get convicted of something or other and then test positive, not once generally, but 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 times on probation or parole until eventually the authorities get tired of it and put them in prison. Well, that's not a very good way to change people's behavior, as anybody who's ever raised a child or trained a puppy understands. It's much more important that a punishment be predictable and immediate than that it be severe. So we need to, this is the general formula for reducing crime and incarceration, we need to apply the minimum effective dose of punishment. Now, other than probation, the main approach to dealing with drug-involved offenders is some form of diversion program, coerced treatment. Say, okay, you got caught committing a crime, we're not going to put you in prison, but you have to go to drug treatment. This is a favorite of the drug policy reform movement. Here's Prop 36 in California. The red line is the baseline. Very unspectacular results. Not surprisingly, we consider that 3/4 of the people who accept the deal of, okay, we won't send you to prison, but you have to do treatment, don't actually finish the treatment. Right? The dirty legal secret of mandatory treatment is that it's voluntary. A judge in Hawaii took a bunch of heavily methamphetamine-used probationers, on probation generally for violent or property crimes, not for drug crimes, and said, okay, fellas, frequent testing, every time you're dirty, you're going to spend a couple nights or a week or 2 weeks in jail, I promise, right now. Here are the outcomes in a randomized controlled trial. They spent about as many days in jail as routine probationers. They spent about a third as many days in prison. They cut their new crimes by half. This program did a better job of producing reductions in drug abuse among heavily drug-involved people, people who would meet criteria for dependence, than any drug treatment program I've ever seen. So here's the violation counts for Hopeland. This is a combination of no-shows and dirty urines among a group of people that had run about 30% no-show plus dirty urine rates per test. You called 100 in for a test, 10 would not show, and 20 would be dirty. Right? This is over a year when they're being frequently and randomly tested. Only half of them ever violated. And basically every sanction reduced the remaining group by about a third. When you got to 3 or 4 sanctions, people were sent to treatment. But then it was a small enough group that you could send them to good treatment. And they mostly got better. So that's what cut the return to prison rate in this group by 2/3. So this is what to do about crime by users. Breaking up the street markets with low arrest crackdowns is what to do about crime by dealers. Raising alcohol taxes and denying alcohol to mean drunks is what to do about alcohol-related crime. All of that doesn't involve legalizing anything, and we can have a lot less drug abuse, a lot less crime, and a lot fewer people behind bars. Thank you.
You know, criminal laws, by and large, are supposed to reflect a moral consensus. The large majority of the laws that we have against rape, against murder, against theft, my guess is 99, 98, 99 point whatever percent of the population agrees that they should be crimes. There's not a real question mark there. But when you have a major political and societal debate about whether something should actually be a crime, that's when the laws really begin to lose their legitimacy. When you take something like the issue of marijuana, we're now over 40%, more than 2 out of every 5 Americans believe it should no longer be a crime, it should be illegal. To continue to enforce those laws, and in fact to increase the arrests and the number of people being punished, I think in a way is to delegitimize the role of government, the role of criminal law. You know, criminal law that should be grounded in a moral consensus evaporates at that time. I think that's the first reason why when you see a law lose that degree of legitimacy, of public legitimacy, that's evidence that it's time to change. Secondly, we need to no longer have America lead the world when it comes to incarceration. You know, Senator Jim Webb from Virginia, who's become something of a champion for us on this issue, and one of the ways he framed it, he goes, what's going on here? Is it simply that we have a much greater number of evil people in this country? Or is there something wrong with our public policies? Something about our sort of knee-jerk, reflexive reliance on punishment and the use of the criminal justice system to deal with things? Now, what you see in other societies that have been more successful in keeping crime down and in keeping incarceration down is a very powerful presumption that incarceration should be the last resort, not the first resort. The last resort, not the first resort, especially with issues involving drug use and other nonviolent offenses, but even with some predatory offenses, whether it involves restitution by people who have stolen to others, what have you. But seeing prison, the deprivation of people's freedom, ripping them out of their homes, giving them a criminal record for life, that's the thing to minimize as much as possible. You know, with some of these diversion programs where Mark and I partially agree and partially disagree, I think diversion programs are important for people who have been involved in petty predatory crime and who have a drug addiction, and it's better to give them alternatives to incarceration and hold them accountable. But we need to get away from the basic model that let's use this tool. Let's use this law enforcement resources. And part of what's happened, I think, is we've become accustomed culturally and societally to relying on this law enforcement tool. And at the same time, of course, we've developed this vast prison industrial complex, which has enormous political power. One of the most powerful, the most powerful union probably in the state of California now is the Prison Guards Union. Is the Prison Guards Union pouring millions of dollars to oppose initiatives in order to keep more people essentially locked up. Prosecutors, DAs go unchallenged. So there's a political force now. I hope that we don't have to wait till President Obama's farewell speech, hopefully in 2017, for him to deliver the sort of warning about the power and pernicious power of the prison industrial complex, like Dwight Eisenhower did in his farewell speech in 1961 about the military-industrial complex. There are innovations short of legalization that can help. We now see throughout Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, England, Spain, Canada, and in a few months Denmark, programs that will protect the drug addicts who cannot quit through methadone maintenance or through drug-free programs and allow them to come to clinics to get pharmaceutical-grade heroin so that they can transform their addiction, their deadly addiction, into merely a drug dependence. The evidence there is it works. It reduces crime, it reduces violence, it reduces incarceration, it reduces the death and disease, and it saves taxpayers money. Recently, the U.S. government paid for a program. They did some research. One was in Toronto, one was in Seattle. It's called Wet Housing. They took the hardcore Skid Row alcoholics, the ones who were costing taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars a person, so they, because of emergency room admissions and because of sending them to local jail. These were incorrigible alcoholics. You know what they did? They didn't lock them up for good. They allowed them to go to housing, and in that housing, they were allowed to drink. Right? They could go in a safe place and drink. In some cases, drink as much as they want. And you know what happened? All of a sudden, this population, they went in there, they weren't involved in crime very much anymore. They weren't showing up in the emergency rooms anymore. They could drink all they want, and you know what happened? They started drinking less. Because they had four walls around them. They had their own place. So many people use drugs in order to close out, to build their walls, to build their space. We need a more compassionate and decent and respectful way of dealing with this phenomenon in our society. Prison and incarceration needs to be the last resort, not the first.
You can respond or expand.
All right. Well, let me start by responding a little bit to both to Ethan's presentation and to Gary Hale's. The central claim, it seems to me, central empirical claim in Ethan Nadelman's first presentation was that the risks of increased use of cannabis as a result of cannabis legalization were modest. I doubt that. And I doubt it for two reasons. One is if we look at the number of people who are in trouble with cannabis, it's on the order of 3 or 4 million nationally. For alcohol, that number is on the order of 15 to 20 million nationally at any one time. Now, it's true, the rate of getting into trouble with alcohol is somewhat higher than for cannabis. It's probably on the order of 18% as opposed to 10%. But it's not the case that cannabis is a lot less fun than alcohol. So I don't have any strong reason to think that we couldn't develop some comparable size problem. And were we to legalize cannabis on anything like the current alcohol model, we would be creating companies devoted to generating and sustaining addiction. 50% of the alcohol consumed in the U.S. is consumed by people who drink 4 or more drinks a day year-round. 50% of the alcohol. So when the booze companies tell you that they're in favor of moderate drinking, they must mean they're planning to go out of business. They're in the alcoholism business. Most of their customers, of course, are not alcoholics, but most of their sales go to people who are drinking too much. The same will be true of legalized cannabis companies. Can we work out an alternative? I think we can. We could require that people either grow their own or form consumer co-ops but not allow large-scale distribution. Would it work? I'm not sure. It's possibly worth a shot. 80% of the people in prison today are not in prison for drug offenses. So, yes, it's useful to reduce drug-related incarceration, but we have a longer way to go than that. Just a couple points that Mr. Hale made that I thought were important. One is, he said that marijuana is available in a liquid form as a medicine. That's only a partial truth. The drug that's available is called Marinol. It contains only THC. That's only one of the agents in cannabis. It's not a substitute. And of course, an oral pill is not a very good thing to do if your problem is nausea. There are ways of delivering cannabis other than smoking it, and they should be developed. But it's not the case that Marinol is a good substitute for cannabis. I don't think cannabis is a particularly important medicine. I think the number of people who will actually benefit from it medically is small, but that's true of lots of drugs. It ought to be made available to them by prescription, not by doctor's recommendation, after we do the research to demonstrate that it's safe and effective, and that can be done. But the most important thing I think I heard from Mr. Hale was that in 1979, when he went to work for DEA and I went to work for the Criminal Division of the Justice Department, that our number one problem drug was marijuana coming from Mexico. We were still at the tail end of the great heroin epidemic, and we were at the very beginning of the great cocaine epidemic. And I think it's an interesting, right? I mean, 5 years after 1979, we're starting the crack trade. I think it's a fascinating question what would have happened in 1979 if we'd taken resources away from enforcing the cannabis laws and put them into enforcing the cocaine laws. Could we have stopped that epidemic before it started? I don't know, but it would have been worth a shot. These are not freebies. So my plea overall is that we get beyond the red team, blue team rhetoric of the war on drugs versus drug policy reform, and ask concrete questions about what concrete policies we could adopt today that would lead to fewer people being in prison a year from now. And I think those policies are available to us. Thanks.
All right, Gary.
Great, thank you. I'll start off with where you ended off a little bit, just touching on one topic, whether it's marijuana or cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin or whatever it may be. Drug traffickers, whether they be on the production side or the distribution side of that entire business cycle, respond to a demand. And they respond to a saying in Spanish. A saying in Spanish is lo que pida el público. Whatever the public wants is what we give. Okay, so that's what they're doing. And why are drugs being cultivated, transported, and distributed in such large numbers, where we've got tons and tons and tons of marijuana in our warehouses? It's because people want that. There's a big consumer base in the United States. We all agree with that. And as long as there is a demand, there will be a supply. So we're stuck in the middle. We DEA. The discussion has kind of moved over more to the question of punitive versus permissive approaches to the drug problem. If we can agree that government at any level, whether it's state, local, or federal, is responsible for protecting its citizens from harm, then we can agree that we have to have some control measures for whatever it is that the legislatures dictate that we control. In this case, to protect our society, we have to control access to substances, whatever they may be, including marijuana, that cause harm. That's defined by the medical community, the legislative community, judicial community. And, it reminds me of one time back in the 80s when we were just chasing these marijuana motherships endlessly. This Coast Guard officer that was also on the water tracking these motherships down asked me. He said, "What are we doing? Are we having any effect? Are we doing any good?" And made me think a good long while about that. Finally, I said to him, "You know what it is? I think what we, federal law enforcement, state, local law enforcement, all the control entities that are out there. What are we? We're the finger in the dike, okay? We're just kind of covering that little hole that if you didn't cover, then that little hole would cause bigger cracks in the dam, and before you know it, all drugs are legal, all drugs are being used openly, even the ones that cause much more harm than marijuana. So what do you do? I'll throw some questions out to you. What do? Do we go to a needle exchange program? Is that similar to giving out condoms to protect people from getting AIDS, or to reduce the amount of people getting AIDS? You hand out condoms for health reasons, public safety reasons. Is that why we are giving or proponents of needle exchange programs? Perhaps. Interestingly, and looking at this historically, a lot of times, especially we're going to be talking about the border. I know there's going to be questions about what's happening in Mexico, which I deal a lot with. I did an interview yesterday with a gentleman from the Houston Chronicle, and I had to back up and give him some historical perspective to get him to understand some of the reasons as to the violence on the border. And it goes back to why is the United States and Mexico, kind of like a strategic area for smuggling. It goes back to the 1800s during the Civil War, where the commodity was cotton, and the North wanted cotton, needed cotton to manufacture many things. And cotton was smuggled from Mexico into Texas, over to Galveston, and then it went around up to the northeast and around the blockades of the South during the Civil War. Then after cotton, it was prohibition. And what was smuggled from Mexico into the United States? Alcohol. And then after that came drugs. And so what do we have? What's the common denominator? It's the smugglers that are smuggling whatever the commodity is that is being demanded by the consumer in the United States, whether it's cotton, alcohol, or drugs. What's going to be next? What's the future beyond drugs if we legalize drugs? Is it going to be some kind of virtual sex thing going on, and we're going to be enforcing people's use of the computer? Who knows? It's an interesting question. But what's happening in Mexico now, and I'll kind of shift over to that direction, has to do with control for territory to smuggle drugs. So whether it was drugs or alcohol or something else, that's what the fight is all about. And that's what we're paying attention to, because that's what we're called to pay attention to at this point in time. Sir.
Thank you. There's some questions that have come up here, but I'd like for you all to be able to talk. Do you have questions for each other at this point?
Well, so on the issue of Mexico, right? One way to read what's going on in Mexico is that for the last 40 years, more or less, the United States government has been demanding of the Mexican government that they solve our drug problem for us. Why are you sending us all these drugs? Why don't you stop your people from sending us all these drugs? And the response from Mexico is, why are you people demanding all those drugs? Why don't you stop your people from demanding all those drugs? It's a very amusing dialogue the first 5 or 10 times you do it, and then it gets a little old. Though I do remember the Mexican official, when we were discussing the issue of certification, the U.S. government every year certifies whether Mexico and other countries are doing their bit to reduce their drug flow to the U.S. And a somewhat annoyed Mexican official turned to one of the American officials and said, why don't you decertify Oregon? If we admitted that most of the value of drugs sold on the street is domestic markups, and that changing the export price from Mexico, or even the flow from Mexico, would not substantially impact the U.S. drug problem. As you say, if people want it, it's going to come from somewhere. And told the Mexican government, look, what's important to you about your drug policies is how well they protect your society. So you let us worry about our drug abuse problem. We will try to do our bit in cutting demand by forcing our drug abusing offenders to cut back on their drug use, as the HOPE Project demonstrates we could do. But don't you worry about our drug problem. And we're not going to give you a hard time if you decide that you need to develop policies that serve the interests of Mexico in Mexican public safety, and stop pretending that you're going to solve our drug problem for us. by the way, we should say the same thing to the Afghan government. It is insane for us to be pushing the Afghan government to worry about how much poppy they grow, given how important other things in Afghanistan are to us right now.
Let me respond to Afghanistan real quick so that we can put things in more or better context with regard to Afghanistan. Over 90 some odd percent, high number of heroin that is produced from the opium that is cultivated in Afghanistan goes to Europe. Okay, very little of the heroin that comes from the opium that is cultivated in Afghanistan comes to the United States. So the question, it begs the question, what the heck are we doing there if very little of that heroin comes to the United States? It goes back to the comment that I made about the nexus between drugs and terrorism. The money that is being made by the Taliban and definitely the Taliban, I don't know about the Al-Qaeda, but the relationship between drugs and terrorism causes U.S. interest in Afghanistan, aside from the institution building and many other things that are going on there. So that's what's happening. That's why we're there, even though it doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive. You've got 90% of the drugs going somewhere else. Why do we care? But we care for that reason. We, as the United States, and that's why DEA has increased its presence there.
But the irony there is that every time we wipe out some farmer's poppy field, we raise the price of opium, right? That's what we're trying to do. Yeah. And since the places we're able to do that are the places that the Afghan government controls, not in the south where the Taliban controls, we are raising the price of opium and giving the Taliban a monopoly in it. This does not seem to me like sensible counterinsurgency strategy.
Yeah, since we're talking about Afghanistan, let me give you my unconventional proposal. Afghanistan, as Gary said, is producing 90%, we believe, of the world's illegal heroin from that opium. On the one hand, the crackdown has the problems that Mark suggested, right? It has the problem of, we're going to push people even further into the hands of the Taliban. That doesn't seem to make much sense. It's limited. It could backfire on us politically. On the other hand, legalization of this thing, which would also resolve that piece of the problem, is not on the horizon. We're not going to legalize opium heroin worldwide. Imagine if somehow you could just snap your fingers and all of Afghanistan's opium and heroin would just disappear. Right? Or imagine that you through an eradication campaign or through a blight or a drought, you could just wipe this stuff out. What would happen essentially? What would happen? It would inevitably would just pop up in a whole series of other. Let me just finish this thing. It would just pop up in the rest of all the other countries whose names end in Stan. It would go back to Burma, pop up in Colombia, Mexico, what have you. It would pop up someplace else, and it might cause all sorts of other problems there. If we did it through eradication, we wiped it out. Millions of people would be flocking into Afghan cities. The Taliban would be getting even greater support as a result. So here's my proposed solution. Let's accept the fact that Afghanistan is going to be the world's provider of illegal heroin. Let's just accept it. And then let's think about Afghanistan as the world's red light zone for heroin, opium production. Right? And that the challenge in Afghanistan is not one of eradication or suppression. It's essentially a vice control challenge. Right? It's going to go, just like with red light zones in urban districts where you accept you can have prostitution, gambling, drugs, and then it's all about trying to regulate this stuff without the cops being corrupted in the process of doing so. Let's accept it, and then let's manipulate the market in Afghanistan and do everything we can so that the people involved in it and profiting from this illegal traffic as much as possible are our people rather than the people on the other side. Right? That effectively, by the way, was to some extent our policy with heroin in Southeast Asia back in the 70s. It was effectively our policy with respect to other drugs at other times. It's about saying we have, as Mark said, bigger objectives and bigger priorities in Afghanistan. And truth be told, although you can never sort of articulate a vice control strategy publicly, a mayor, a police can never own it and say that's our strategy, I would say that it's probably the case that for Richard Holbrooke, the special ambassador, and for NATO, and for the British advisors on the opium policy in Afghanistan, on some level, that's probably what they're thinking as well.
What about the idea of paying the Afghan farmers for the poppies and providing morphine for pain relief around the world?
All right. Been there, done that, have the T-shirt. For people who are interested in the technical side of this, there's a paper in the New Journal of Drug Policy Analysis that's called the Send-Lease proposal, and there's a very careful analysis of it. The quick version of it is as follows. Land and labor to grow poppy are not scarce in Afghanistan. If we buy the entire crop,
We'll move your back, move it further back.
if we buy the entire crop, they'll sell us one crop and grow another crop for the traffickers. The traffickers can afford to pay whatever they need to pay for the opium, because the opium is a very small part of the price of heroin. So it's not the case that we could take the opium away from the traffickers by buying it because more would be produced. It's not the case that we could relieve pain around the world by producing morphine. The reason people around the world don't get morphine is not because there's not enough opium out there, but because the regulatory mechanisms don't permit it. And that, unfortunately, is true in this country, too. We massively undertreat pain. That's not a problem of scarcity of opium. So it looks to me like the Send-Lease proposal is a solution to exactly no problem. Now, it's true that there's a problem that people in Afghanistan find it hard to get their crops to market because there are roadblocks, and therefore they're poor. And I think the thing we got to do about the fact that they're poor is give them money. Not necessarily for their opium, just give them money. We're spending $65 billion on the war in Afghanistan this year. The GDP of Afghanistan is $12.5 billion. For $6 billion, we could abolish poverty in government-held Afghanistan. And I think we should be figuring out the technical ways of doing that. Handing out dollars, obviously not Afghanis, or we'd have horrible inflation there. But we could jumpstart the Afghan economy at a trivial fraction of what we're spending to drop bombs.
Bill, this is messed up because I agree with every word he just said.
Mark said something early in his remarks about what was the actual proportion of money to the cartels that comes from marijuana. A common figure that's bruited about is that 50, 60, even 70% of the money comes from that. Would you respond to what do you think the amount of, obviously cocaine costs more. The argument has been that there's so many more marijuana users that raises it up. You gave some figures. Would you all talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to address it to the best that I can. I can't give you a dollar figure, but I can give you some idea what's going on with regards to that. We U.S. government, using various resources, and I always use this phrase, from satellites to submarines and everything in between, do a lot of studies to determine how many acres of whatever is being cultivated, whether it's opium fields or coca leaf fields or marijuana fields and things of that nature. So there's estimates that come out from the interagency community that say there's so many, how many eggs could a chicken lay? How much cocaine can be produced by the cocaine-producing countries based on these studies. So from that, we can get an idea how much cocaine is being sent to market, whether it's the European market or the American market or wherever it may be. And from that, you can draw some conclusions as to some possible revenue intake. And you can do the same thing with any of the drugs that are cultivated as opposed to manufactured, like methamphetamine is manufactured, not cultivated. When we look at all of those factors, we see that, at least for Mexico, because our focus here in the Houston Division is Mexico. We touch upon Colombia and the South American source countries a lot because cocaine is coming from there. But it's coming through Mexico, so our focus is always Mexico. So we look at the whole question, whether it's an economic revenue question or drug flows question with relationship to Mexico. Whenever the cartels are having problems with drug movement, like they're having now post-Calderon, since Calderon took office in 2006, there's been a dramatic change up in how drugs flow through Mexico into the United States. It's almost to the point where they can't move their drugs. The cartels can't move their drugs into the United States, and they're certainly not moving their drugs as easily and efficiently as they were previous to Calderon. So what does that mean? That means that revenues are down for cocaine sales. their mainstay, we have found, for keeping their revenues at a level, whatever that level is that they wish, is marijuana. In Mexico, marijuana can be cultivated year-round. NAFTA was a boon for a lot of agricultural growers in Mexico, such that a lot of companies and growers in the United States are complaining that Mexico is dumping tomatoes and dumping avocados and dumping all these fruits into the United States. Why? Because they can cultivate those fruits and vegetables year-round in Mexico. They have a tremendous climate that allows for that. Same thing with marijuana. They can grow marijuana and harvest marijuana at least 6 times a year, maybe sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on rain. So marijuana is plentiful, so plentiful that we have 37.5 tons in Laredo, and 37.5 tons that just got burned out of the McAllen office, and that sustains the Mexican cartels insofar as a consistent source of revenue. What the numbers are, I don't have that information available to me. We could probably give some estimates. That's not our realm in DEA, but I'll give you an idea how important marijuana is to the overall revenue intake of the cartels involved in drug trafficking.
If it were legalized, would it have a bad effect on the cartels?
Well, then you need an economist to answer that question. An economy, the basic supply and demand. If you flood the market with a product, the price is going to go down. So, and if the price goes down, the revenues go down. And if the revenues go down, then we're going to change up and go to a different product that's going to keep you at the revenue level that you wish if you're the cartel. So that's the best I can answer that one.
If we want to solve Mexico's drug problem, we can do it tomorrow. Take the AWACS planes and the ships out of the Caribbean. Mexico's the cocaine transshipment point because we made it hard to get cocaine from Colombia to Miami. If we undo that, Mexico has no role in that trade. And so we got a choice. Do we want to mess up Mexico, which is our most important foreign partner, or do we want to mess up Cuba and Jamaica? Is this hard?
Well, we went back and forth. I was very honored to go to the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico in about 1993, commissioned by Attorney General Janet Reno to look at that very problem. It was Mexico, it was the Caribbean, it's Mexico again, and it had to do, that change up back and forth. Why are the drugs coming through Mexico? Why were they going through the Caribbean? Had to do with our federal or United States government policies and effort against the Colombians. The Colombians used to have representatives in Mexico that caused all that movement through Mexico, and then over a long period of time, at least a decade or more, we put so much pressure on the Colombians. We arrested Colombians, took their money, did all this stuff to really hurt their business, such that they decided to stay home. They decided to stay home, and they were no longer going to go out into Mexico or the Caribbean. Well, it shifted to the Caribbean because it was easier for that reason. So then the Caribbean was a big problem for us, and then we put a lot of resources in the Caribbean, and then the Mexicans decided, well, okay, since the Colombians are not coming to Mexico to broker the transportation of the drug and so forth and so on, we'll go to Colombia. So they started going to Colombia, and that's what's happening now. The Mexicans are going to Colombia to broker the transportation of wholesale quantities, multi-ton quantities of cocaine into Mexico and onto the United States. Also, the distribution, really quick, the distribution used to be all Colombian, in all Colombian hands from production to distribution. That means they made it, they transported it, and they sold it in the United States. It was all Colombian prior to, let's say, in the late 80s and 90s. And now, because of this change-up that I told you about, the Colombians are staying home. We don't want anything to do with it. We've been burned by the United States. They've taken our properties, jailed our people, extradited our people, and so on and so forth. So now they've given it all up to the Mexicans, and now the Mexicans are doing the importation from Colombia into Mexico, the transportation into the United States, and the distribution in the United States cities. So it's now largely a Mexican enterprise as opposed to a Colombian enterprise.
Bill, if I could just throw this into a broader perspective, I used the phrase harm reduction before, And harm reduction generally refers to those interventions to try to reduce the negative consequences of drug use or other risky activities among people who keep persisting in doing them. It's needle exchange programs to reduce AIDS. It's motorcycle helmets to reduce accidents on motorcycles. It's designated driving norms. It's anything that you do to reduce the negative consequences of a risky activity. Now, you can define harm reduction more broadly, though. And the way I would define what I hope for on global drug policy is a global harm reduction policy. And that means let's accept the fact that drugs are here to stay, that there's essentially never been a drug-free society in human history, except maybe the Eskimos because they couldn't grow anything, but I mean, leave them aside. And let's accept that drugs are here to stay. We're never going to be a drug-free society. In fact, there's only going to be more and more drugs emerging, legally and illegally, legal pharmaceutical companies, illegal, whatever, you name it. Right? Let's also accept for the time being that the drug laws are going to remain in place. Right? And then the question becomes, how do we most successfully reduce both the harms of drugs and the harms of our government policies? That becomes the objective. How do we treat addiction primarily as a health issue? How do we reduce incarceration? How do we reduce the organized crime and the violence and the corruption, the stuff that DEA focuses on? And I think one of the things that's been most problematic with the stuff that Gary was talking about was what seems to me a virtual absence of any sort of strategic thinking about how to manage illegal drug marketing, production, and distribution. I mean, when I made that sort of somewhat cynical but real politique, recommendation about Afghanistan, but back in the early, when was it Vice President Bush in the Reagan years, headed the Caribbean Task Force, and they cracked down on drugs coming from Colombia or whatever, and they caught a lot of marijuana because marijuana is bulky and easy to find and identify, and they provided a clear incentive for the traffickers to switch into cocaine. You saw this happen in Jamaica as the transit countries. There's a series of wonderful articles by the anthropologist Ansley Hamid who tracked the evolution from the marijuana markets to the crack cocaine markets, which the Jamaicans, for that matter, didn't know how to manage. And similarly, when the big push came to crack down on coca production in Bolivia, it's as if nobody stopped to think and say, my God, what happens if we crack down successfully in Bolivia? Who's going to produce the world's coca? Maybe it'll go to Colombia. And goddamn, we don't want it to go to Colombia, because it goes to Colombia, you got a 40-year-old civil insurgency there, they're closer to U.S. borders, all this sort of stuff. There was no strategic thinking. If I'd been in charge of that and accepting the fact that prohibition was going to stay in place, at that point I would say, you know what? Let's leave all the coca production in Bolivia. Let's encourage all of it to go to Bolivia. You know why? Because Bolivia doesn't present any major strategic threat to American interests. It doesn't have an ocean border. It's landlocked with nothing else going on there. Don't quote me to the Bolivians on this thing. But I mean, as a harm reduction measure, accepting the fact that Bolivia was going to produce the world's coca probably would have been the best possible thing in terms of America's broader national security interests, economic interests, political interests, and for that matter, probably public health interests as well.
So let me
Okay,
if I can generalize this.
Okay, we'll
Sure.
have that's your last statement, and then you two get the last statement.
So if we think about this not as war fighting, but as flood control, right? The volume of drugs flowing into the United States is determined entirely by the willingness of Americans to pay for drugs and to sell each other drugs. We can try to control that, for example, by forcing the drug-involved offenders who consume the vast bulk of illegal drugs, because it's hard to be a heavy drug user without also being a property offender. We can force them to stop by using probation supervision, so we can cut down our demand that way. Our current approach to cutting down on demand by lying to school children is not nearly as effective. But whatever demand we don't cut down on, right, that amount of drugs is going to flow in, and then we have to ask, what is the least destructive channel through which that quantity of drug could flow into the U.S.? That's the strategic problem as I'd set it up. Gary?
No, it's fair. That's a fair argument. I'll add something that kind of goes along with that. There's interesting strategic ramifications of the study that we just finished just yesterday. As a matter of fact, I got the final copy on my desk, and we're going to be sending up to Washington very soon to be published internal to government, and it has to do with the net worth of the Gulf Cartel Zeta organization. And the interesting piece of all that is that by looking at all the revenue sources, and they're increasingly involved, and they've evolved from an enforcement arm for the Gulf Cartel, I'm talking about the Zeta organization, They were just thugs that were protecting the Gulf Cartel people, and then they became a drug trafficking organization in and of themselves, still working with the Gulf Cartel. Now they're basically a traditional organized crime organization like the mafia, the old mafia. And if you look at their revenue sources, which is drugs and prostitution and alcohol sales and petroleum theft and just a whole range of things that the Zetas are involved in, drugs is a very small part of, it's 15 to 20% of all of their revenues are drugs, which is, what does that say? You know, I mean, there's a lot of policy questions that need to be researched a little further, analyzed and discussed. But what it says is that all this happened, this evolution of this particular organization going strictly away from drugs as a revenue source and now into traditional organized crime activities happened post-Calderon, 2006 and forward. So what does that mean? That means that we're affecting their ability to make money, lots of money, their only source of money through drugs. And now they're using other crime activities to generate their income, anywhere from 80% to a little more than 80%. So they're changing up. You know, if I can't move drugs, if I can't make money on drug transport, movement, sales, then I'll tax the heck out of, and I'll extort money from businesses in Mexico. I'll, exact taxes on the sale of pirated DVDs. The Zeta organization is importing pirated DVDs and CDs by the millions into Mexico, and they're being distributed just like a drug would be distributed. And they're getting millions of dollars in revenues from that. So they're shifting. They're shifting into traditional organized crime activities and away from drugs, not going away from drugs completely, but they're diversifying so that they can continue their revenue stream. So it's really interesting how the effects of the various policies impact on drug traffickers.
Thank you very much. Two things before we close. One, as Gary mentioned, he has prepared a CD and there are a limited number of copies here. Some of you have already got them, I think. I would like to ask that the members of the Baker Institute Roundtable get first crack at those, and then if they're after a few minutes, if there are still some, and others of you who might like to take one, you're welcome to do that. Secondly, remember that Mark Kleiman has his book, will have his book available outside for you to purchase and to sign. I want to thank you for coming and thank our panelists for a lively and informative evening, and also to let you know, as Ambassador Turidzian pointed out at the beginning, this is to be continued.